You might think pirates spent most of their time shouting "Arr!" and hunting for buried treasure, but their biggest enemy wasn't rival crews or the Royal Navy. It was infection and injury. Picture this. You're mid-battle, cannonballs whistling past, swords clashing, and suddenly an enemy cut takes your arm. Now what? If you think pirates pause to ask, is this really necessary? Think again. The truth is, pirate doctors amputated first, asked questions later, and not because they were bloodthirsty lunatics, though some probably were, but because their options were grim, filthy, and often fatal. Let me tell you, the way they handled amputation wasn't just crude. It was a maddening mix of desperation, accidental innovation, and some seriously questionable judgment. And trust me, the solutions they came up with are as wild as a midnight rum brawl. Here's something history books don't tell you. Pirates had a bigger problem than enemy muskets. They had the human body itself, which was really terrible at staying alive when sliced open on a rocking wooden ship in the Caribbean heat. Infection was the real Blackbeard lurking in the shadows. Without antibiotics, which wouldn't be invented until about 200 years later, even a tiny cut could turn the grimiest pirate's leg into Swiss cheese. And believe me, it usually did, because hygiene on board ranked somewhere between seaweed collector and open sewer. So when someone lost a limb, or even just messed up their leg, pirate doctors often skipped the whole "let's see if this gets better" phase and went straight for the saw. Let's set the scene. A typical pirate ship in the early 1700s might have 50 to 100 guys crammed into spaces about as cozy as a coffin. These ships carried roughly 600 gallons of freshwater when fully stocked, spread out over several barrels, but that was never enough to wash wounds properly. Salt water was the closest they had for cleaning cuts, but seawater is basically salty and dirty, 3.5% salt content, and teeming with microbes that would give any modern hospital nightmare flashbacks. So scrubbing a wound usually meant rubbing it with whatever was on hand: gunpowder, rum, or sometimes crushed leaves, which only made things worse. I mean, talk about ruining your fearsome reputation by sitting there screaming while your doctor pours fire down your open artery. Now, before we dive into the saw-wielding madness, let's talk about some of their pre-amputation attempts. Because pirates did try to save limbs sometimes, but spoiler alert, it didn't work. One classic method was to whip up a potion or poultice made of urine and mud, which they believed had healing properties. The logic was, well, it's sterilish in theory, and if it smells bad, it must be killing germs, right? Bad idea. Really bad idea. Imagine applying that to a deep wound on a rolling ship wearing your finest leather boots, not exactly a spa day. These bandages just gave bacteria a 5-star resort, complete with the all-you-can-eat buffet. Results: wounds festered, sometimes turning green or black, and the crewman was left with a choice: suffer a slow death or embrace the saw. Another failed attempt involved using gunpowder to cauterize wounds. The doctor would sprinkle the black powder directly into the bleeding cut and light it. Conceptually, it's a neat idea. Burn the wound shut to stop bleeding and kill germs. But practically, let's just say it was not pretty. One infamous incident aboard Captain Kidd's ship in 1701 involved a pirate who lost a leg to cannon fire and had the wound cauterized with twice the amount of gunpowder needed. The resulting explosion sent shrapnel flying and left the ship's rat population in hysterics. The patient survived, but spent 2 weeks painfully explaining why he looked more like a fireworks show than a fearsome sea dog. Desperate and bleeding, pirates eventually figured out something clever when it came to preventing infection: amputation. Now, you might think amputations back then were like those precise operations you see in TV dramas. Nope. Picture a pirate doctor, let's call him Doc Bones, a grizzled man with one eye and shaky hands, armed with nothing but a saw, a bottle of rum, and maybe some cotton. The real genius was recognizing that removing the infected limb quickly cut off the spread of disease through the body. Pirates didn't understand bacteria or germs, of course, but their brutal trial and error landed them on something science now confirms. Once gangrene sets in, there's no house call, just a timely chop. Historians tell us that survival rates for amputations back then were shockingly high, about 70% when done fast and under 3 to 5 minutes, which is actually impressive considering the circumstances. For comparison, Surgeries lasting longer than 5 minutes doubled death rates due to shock and blood loss. Speed was king. Because of the ship's constant movement, the doctor had to get the job done before the pirate squealed loud enough to wake the dead, or worse, the captain. Take the example of Calico Jack, the famous pirate captain operating in the Bahamas during the early 18th century. One day during a skirmish, one of his men named Jack Rackham got a nasty cut on the thigh, and infection set in quick. Doc Bones, who was actually the ship's quartermaster moonlighting as a medic, grabbed his saw and told Jack to hold still or be shark bait. The procedure was done in under 4 minutes with Jack barely able to curse because rum was his only anesthetic. He survived and went on to become a legendary figure. The upside: pirates gained a sort of grim respect for their ship surgeons, despite their preference for boot camp-style medicine over bedside manners. Now, exactly how did these amputations go down? First, the pirate docs would wrap a tight tourniquet above the site, usually with a strip of rope or leather, to choke off blood flow and reduce bleeding. This might sound like basic first aid, but it saved many a life on pirate ships where any excess bleeding could mean an early swim with the fishes. Then, with a saw that looked more like a rusty bread knife, they sawed off the limb as fast as humanly possible with as much swearing as bedside compassion. No anesthesia meant biting on a wooden plank or holding a barrel for dear life while sweat and tears mixed with salt spray on the deck. After the chop, the challenge wasn't over. Stopping the bleeding was crucial, so they'd apply pitch, a sticky black tar used on the ship's hull, or hot coals to seal blood vessels. It sounds horrific and might remind you of medieval torture, but it also significantly reduced death by hemorrhage. Hull pitch acted kind of like today's surgical glue, except it smelled like a bonfire in a leather shop during a thunderstorm. Pirates didn't have sterile gloves, antiseptics, or even candles. They relied on sunlight and whatever water was unspoiled, which was rare. But this witch doctor approach often saved their lives, or at least kept them alive long enough to get ashore. What's really fascinating is that pirate doctors, in all their rough and ready glory, stumbled upon what we now call shock management without even realizing it, keeping the patient calm and bleeding controlled, slathering the wound to prevent air exposure, and immediate amputation to stop spreading infection. These are principles modern medicine embraces, but that pirates practiced because the consequences of failure were downright ghastly. Speaking of consequences, let's not forget the gross parts. Amputation wasn't just about losing a limb. It often meant dealing with maggot-ridden stumps later, because the tropical climate on their ships was basically a breeding ground for all kinds of creepy crawlies. You can imagine the screams when the first patients started to notice that the wriggling inside their dressings wasn't seaweed after all. Pirates developed a twisted kind of humor about this, comparing their amputated stumps to island treasures, because both attracted unwanted visitors. It's basically a gruesome version of pest control, but with a lot more screaming and rum. And then there was the awkward social factor. Losing a hand or leg in battle might seem like a badge of honor, but it also meant adapting quickly to life at sea with less than ideal prosthetics, usually wooden hooks or peg legs. The first known pirate with a hook hand, the legendary hook-handed Henry, really set the trend in the 1720s, proving you could still be terrifying even if you looked like a walking pirate costume store mannequin. But man, talk about catching your finger on everything. It definitely slowed down sword fights and the occasional grog-stealing jellyfish. So why amputate first? Because if you don't, small wounds became armies of bacteria ready to invade your bloodstream. You might have been a fearsome pirate with a cutlass but lose a leg to gangrene, and suddenly you're the crew's problem child. And that's assuming you lived long enough for the doc to get the saw out. Pirates weren't just slices of adventure and swagger. They lived some of the harshest survival stories ever told, and amputation, brutal as it was their grim lifeline. But we're just getting started. Wait until I tell you about the strange tools they used, the bizarre painkillers that would make your dentist cringe, and how some pirates managed to survive not one but multiple amputations without dropping a single hair. So hang on tight, because if you thought pirate surgery was all glorious battle cries and dashing cuts, you haven't heard the half of it. But more about that in the next part. But hold on, before you start imagining pirate doctors as mere saw-wielding maniacs, Let's zoom in on the curious arsenal they actually used. A motley collection of tools that looked like they'd been swiped from a blacksmith's shop, a butcher's knife block, and an apothecary's cupboard all at once. Pirates didn't have fancy scalpels or sterilized kits. No, their operating room was usually the dirty, creaking deck of a ship, swaying under a blistering sun or the threat of a storm, with nothing but a set of instruments that make a modern hospital cringe. There were bone saws, which looked like giant, jagged bread knives, amputation knives shaped more for stabbing than slicing, and pliers that probably doubled as tools for pulling nails or setting rigging. And if you thought they just grabbed the first decent blade they found, think again. These tools were often carefully maintained, sharpened to a deadly edge, and reserved specifically for those life-or-limb moments. And speaking of moments, timing was everything. Pirates had no concept of sterile procedure, but they absolutely grasped that speed saved lives. The average amputation had to be done in just 3 to 5 minutes, or the poor soul on the receiving end was toast, literally. Blood loss, shock, or infection would claim them quickly otherwise. They didn't stop to nibble around the edges either. If the limb was infected below the elbow or knee, off it came, straight down to the nearest joint or bone. Why? Because the pirate's alternative was lurking gangrene, a nasty assailant that turns flesh black, swells limbs to grotesque sizes, and smells like the last hurrah of a rotting fish market. Pirates weren't just chopping to save the arm. They were chopping to save the whole damn body. Now, how about the painkillers? You're probably hoping for some soothing rum-based anesthetic or maybe a homemade opium concoction. Well, close enough. Pirates used rum, but not exactly like the pain-free shot of courage you might think. The typical dose was a swig or two, enough to slightly dull the senses but nowhere near enough to knock someone unconscious. Then it was down to brute strength for the patient, who might also be made to bite down on a wooden stick or leather strap to help manage the screaming. Think of it as the 18th century version of hold my beer on a really bad day. Occasionally, they'd use mandrake root or henbane, plants with sedative properties, but misdosing was common and often led to hallucinations or worse, paralysis without pain relief. Pirates, shockingly, preferred the noisy resilience route to a trippy trip any day. But here's where it gets even crazier. Not all amputations were emergencies. Pirates sometimes preemptively chopped off fingers, toes, or tips of limbs to avoid infection spreading, especially when the crew couldn't afford to lose a man to sickness for weeks. This sounds insane, like taking a chainsaw to yourself just in case, but in reality, it was a surprisingly smart move. Limited medical knowledge taught them that waiting meant a slow death, while immediate amputation meant at least a chance to rejoin the fight or the rum table later. In fact, a pirate known as Thomas II reportedly lost a finger to a bet gone wrong and claimed it actually saved him from a later infection during rough Caribbean campaigns. So sometimes, amputating first wasn't just a medical necessity, it was a strategic gambit. Of course, even with their quick chops and questionable painkillers, pirate doctors had to wrestle with one huge problem after the blow was dealt: post-amputation infection, that silent killer lurking below deck. Here, pirates got creative in their own grim way. They used a variety of poultices and dressings, ranging from crushed herbs like rue and lavender, which had mild, antiseptic qualities, to slathering wounds with honey or sugar to draw out infection. Turns out, honey has natural antibacterial effects thanks to its high sugar content and low moisture. The stuff is basically the 18th century Band-Aid, just stickier and much more expensive in the Caribbean. But pirates didn't always know this, and using sugar came at a cost. It attracted flies eager to turn a man's stump into their favorite hangout spot. Imagine trying to patch up a wound with a squirming guest list of bugs drawn to the sweet spread. Talk about a party foul. Another favorite dressing was tar or pitch, the very same sticky black goo used to seal ships from water. Applying it to wounds sounds utterly grotesque. It smelled like burnt leather on a bonfire and felt like smearing candle wax on raw skin. But it had the practical benefit of sealing the wound from air exposure and waterborne filth. So the pitch created a sort of barrier comparable to modern surgical dressings, albeit one that could cause terrible burns and sometimes trapped infection inside instead of killing it. Pirates lived this constant tension between protective and just plain torture in their post-amputation care. Now, survival was one thing, but what about long-term recovery? You might think pirates rested up after losing a limb, letting nature do its thing. Nope, pirate life demanded resilience. Losing a hand or foot wasn't an excuse to slack off. Instead, amputees had to adapt quickly or risk losing their place on the ship, and with that, their share of treasure, food, and glory. Prosthetics in the pirate world were a mishmash of wooden pegs, metal hooks, and sometimes even leather contraptions tied on with rope. The infamous Captain Blackbeard reportedly used a wooden leg after losing his own foot during a raid, giving him a distinctive swagger that struck fear into enemies, and probably made sitting on deck a bit precarious. These wooden limbs were functional enough to let pirates climb rigging or swing from the yardarm, though not without challenges. Catching a wooden hook on a rope or battling a peg leg during a sword fight was a near-daily hazard, but pirates didn't let that stop them. Adapt or die was more than a motto, it was daily reality. And what about those who didn't just lose a hand or a foot, but had to endure multiple amputations over time? Surprisingly, some pirates did live through this medical roulette. One notorious figure, Calico Jack Rackham, mentioned earlier, was rumored to have had more than one limb partially severed, but survived thanks to sheer stubbornness and quick pirate doctor work, including Doc Bones' speedy saw chops. These multi-amputees became legendary, not just for their battle scars, but for their unyielding spirit. They were proof that you could lose parts and still keep your place at the grog table. Pirates had this brutal way of turning disability into swagger. Imagine a one-handed pirate waving a hook wildly in battle, while regaling the crew with tales that made the rest believe missing limbs were gifts from the sea gods. But wait, there's more. Pirates weren't only amputating arms and legs. Sometimes they dealt with so-called field expedient amputations that today's medics would call downright barbaric. For instance, there are recorded incidents of toes being chopped off because of frostbite during chilling nights at sea, even in the tropics, when ships caught cold currents or hurricanes blew in. Frostbite to pirates is wild to imagine, but intense storms and icy Caribbean squalls were no joke. And when the toes went, so went balance, leaving the pirate stumbling around at sea, which was the beginning of another survival challenge altogether. However, amputating those dead parts stopped gangrene in its tracks, and as grim as it sounds, it was the best option available. Now, since pirates were masters of improvisation, their battlefield amputations sometimes involved weird techniques borrowed from other trades. The circular method involved twisting a limb until blood vessels snapped before sawing. The logic was that cutting off circulation beforehand meant less blood loss. Modern medicine calls this grossly outdated and dangerous. But for pirates, it was an accessible technique when tourniquets weren't handy or reliable. Because let's be honest, tying a tight rope on a squirming, screaming guy during a cannonball blast isn't exactly precision surgery. In a notable case documented aboard the ship Adventure Galley under pirate Captain Henry Every, this technique saved a crewman's life by limiting hemorrhage, even if it left the poor guy with a bloody, twisty stump that looked like a nautical pretzel. And if you think bandaging was straightforward, think again. Pirate doctors had to fabricate dressings from whatever fabric was on hand: canvas, linen, sometimes even old sails cut into strips. But reusing dressings was common due to lack of supplies, leading to persistent reinfection risks. Imagine wrapping a wound stuffed with layers of salty sailcloth, infected seawater, and God knows what else. The smell alone would make a town crier faint. Pirates tried to compensate with smokes from burning rope fibers or herbs thought to have antiseptic properties. But let's just say these efforts were hit or miss, and often hit by a big dose of miss. Still, some pirates dared to take these laborious efforts seriously, basically running what was a floating, makeshift field hospital, minus any of the cleanliness or standards. So after all this, it might sound like pirate doctors were reckless hacks with rusty saws and a questionable bedside manner. And well, they kind of were. But here's the jaw-dropping thing. Their brutal, fast, and often crude approach to amputation wasn't just guesswork. Pirates were practicing an early form of triage and emergency surgery that laid groundwork for modern battlefield medicine. Their terrifying experiences, forged from necessity, accelerated the understanding that quick decisions, immediate action, and gangrene prevention were key to saving lives. They didn't have microscopes or antiseptics, but they sure knew how to keep their crews alive long enough to see another battle, sometimes even with one less limb and a wooden leg to boot. And as if that wasn't enough, the culture of the ship encouraged sharing stories about amputations, survival, and makeshift treatments. This oral tradition passed down lessons, and believe it or not, some medical best practices through generations of seafarers. So when you hear tales of pirates with hooks and peg legs, remember they're not just fanciful costumes, but badges of hardcore survival and early medical innovation on the high seas. Turns out these saw-swinging, rum-fueled docks were pioneers, albeit of the most brutal kind. So next time you imagine pirates, don't just see swashbucklers with parrots and treasure maps. Picture those same rough characters clutching their stumps, drinking rum through gritted teeth, and silently thanking the quick work of their ships' saw-bearing dock bones. Because when it came to surviving the cutlass as well as the surgeon's blade, pirates proved that amputating first and asking questions later wasn't just a grim necessity. It was the ultimate high-stakes survival hack. Cheers to that. Alright, so we've covered how pirates treated injuries and why sawing off a limb before debating was their go-to survival hack. But hold tight, because now we're diving even deeper into the wild, grimy, and downright ingenious world of pirate medical madness. First up, let's talk about the actual tools of terror those saw-swinging docks wielded onboard ships that were anything but clean. You'd think a pirate's medical kit was just a battered box of sharp things. But no, these guys had a surprisingly well-curated mix of instruments, just without any of the modern sterility. Picture bone saws that looked like they came off a rejected bakery set giant, serrated, and rusty enough to make a dentist faint, alongside amputation knives shaped more for stabbing than slicing, more stabby than nifty. Then they had pliers probably stolen from the riggers, which pulled out splinters, nails, and no doubt the odd rogue fish bone. Their version of surgical precision was about fast, hard, and effective, like a butcher with somewhere else to be. Now, sharpening these bad boys was an art form. Surgeons kept them razor sharp because dull blades meant longer cuts, more pain, and quite frankly, more curse words. Imagine trying to saw off a limb with a butter knife versus a chainsaw. Speed was life. And here's the kicker, because there were no anesthetics beyond a slug of rum or the occasional reckless herbal remedy like mandrake root, which might knock you out or just make you hallucinate you're wrestling a kraken. The patient's agony was part of the game. Biting down on a wooden plank was standard protocol. No whining or you get a swim with the sharks. Now, timing was essential. Pirate doctors knew from harsh trial and error that amputations needed to be done lightning fast, usually under 5 minutes. If you dragged out your chop, blood loss and shock would turn you into fish food faster than a lucky cannonball. That meant no dainty slicing or heroic attempts to save a twitching finger. If gangrene had started creeping up your limb, off it came, straight to the nearest joint or bone. Why? Because gangrene's the pirate's nightmare, turning flesh black, swelling limbs grotesquely, and smelling like a rotting fish market's last hurrah. Talk about ruining your fearsome reputation when your own body starts smelling worse than the bilge. Pirates didn't understand bacteria or germs, but they sure knew when to chop, or else watch a mate slowly rot away. But wait, pirates were nothing if not resourceful, even when it looked like they were chopping at random. After the saw came out, stopping the bleeding was next, and this was where things got really creative. They'd lash a tourniquet, usually a strip of rope or a piece of leather, above the amputation site to cut off blood flow. This sounds primitive, but it was surprisingly effective in preventing immediate death by hemorrhage. And then, to seal the wound, doctors would smear pitch or tar. Yes, the same sticky black stuff used to waterproof ships, right onto the raw stump. Imagine burning sticky goo smeared on open flesh in sweltering heat with zero sterilization. Sounds like torture, but pitch helped seal blood vessels and keep out dirty seawater and rogue sea bugs, reducing fatal infections and blood loss. Pirates were basically slapping on their version of surgical glue, only smellier and much stickier. Sometimes, instead of pitch, hot coals were pressed to the wound to cauterize it, brutal but effective. You can probably guess how that ended for some patients: scorched flesh, smoke-filled decks, and a lot of hollering. Speaking of infection, The real silent killer aboard those swaying floating prisons wasn't enemy fire, but the creeping decay lurking in pirate wounds. Tropical heat and humidity made ships a perfect petri dish for bacteria and maggots, the latter earning a spot in pirate folklore as the stowaway crew members. Pirates often screamed about the dancing worms wiggling in their wounds, but the flies and maggots actually sometimes helped by eating away dead tissue, though the horror show for the patient was brutal. To fight reinfection, doctors tried all sorts of poultices, crushed herbs like rue and lavender, believed to have mild antiseptic properties, or honey, which we now know has real antibacterial effects thanks to its high sugar content and low moisture. That's basically Piraterra super Band-Aid status. But honey had its downsides, sticky and sweet. It attracted hordes of flies, turning a healing stump into a buzzing bug party. Pirates didn't have sterile cotton or gloves. Instead, they reused strips of canvas or old sails for dressings, which unfortunately often just recycled infections. The smell wafting from those makeshift bandages was reportedly enough to knock out even the hardiest sea dogs. Now, what about pain relief? You're probably imagining pirates gulping down bottles of rum until they passed out clothes, but not quite. Rum was indeed the most common anesthetic, but doses were usually limited to a swig or two. Enough to slightly dull senses, not enough to stop screaming completely. Mandrake root and henbane were sometimes used, but miscalculations often resulted in hallucinations or paralysis without pain relief. Trip to the depths didn't mean the ocean floor, but rather a psychedelic nightmare. So most amputations involved the patient gripping a wooden plank while Doc Bones swung his saw swiftly, curses flying as spectators held their breath. It was pain on demand, and patience was not exactly a virtue on a pirate ship mid-battle. And here's a wild twist for you. Not all amputations were emergencies from battle wounds. Sometimes pirates chopped off fingers, toes, or parts of limbs preemptively to stop infection from spreading. Sounds insane, like self-mutilating overkill, but these quick decisions sometimes saved lives. When you consider it, losing a finger to disease was better than losing your life to that slow, seaborne version of death called gangrene. One famed pirate, Thomas II, reportedly sliced off a finger after an injury got infected, and swore it saved him from a fatal fever during a grueling Caribbean campaign. Amputation became a strategic, if gruesome, survival tactic rather than just battlefield damage control. Post-amputation life aboard a pirate ship wasn't a vacation either. Pirates had no luxury of bed rest. Missing a hand or foot meant adapting fast or getting tossed overboard. Prosthetics were basic: wooden pegs, crude metal hooks, or rope-bound leather replacements. The notorious hook-handed Henry in the 1720s led the charge in turning pirate handicap into terrifying fashion. His wooden hook became the terror of the Caribbean, but also a hazard catching on rigging, grog mugs, and even the occasional jellyfish. Same for peg legs, like the one Captain Blackbeard allegedly sported after losing a foot during a raid. Functional enough for climbing rigging or brandishing swords, but peg legs came with their own hazards. Tripping on deck was less an embarrassment and more a death trap on board a tossing ship. You might think losing multiple limbs would be a death sentence, and often it was. But some lucky or incredibly stubborn pirates survived more than one amputation, earning legendary status. Calico Jack Rackham, famous for his flamboyant style and misadventures, was said to have endured multiple limb injuries and amputations, partly thanks to speedy pirate docs who had perfected their chop technique. These multi-amputees became living proof that even missing body parts didn't mean the party was over. Instead, they became cherished storytellers and symbols of endurance whose scars buckled eyes and earned respect, even if their one-handed sword fights looked like a comedy show to rivals. Now for a bizarre twist, pirates didn't just battle swords and cannonballs, they even fought frostbite. Yes, frostbite. Imagine that in the Caribbean. But it turns out violent storms and cold ocean currents could chill a pirate to the bone during hurricane season or long cold nights at sea. Anecdotal records describe toes being chopped off because of frostbite, a classic case of better to lose a toe than your life. Losing toes threw off balance at sea, turning the amputee into something between a tipsy sailor and a clumsy marionette, but it beat the alternative gangrene. Pirates never shied away from tough choices. Sometimes the saw was their last friend before the sea took you. Talking about techniques, besides basic chopping, pirates also used weird surgical tricks. One of them was the circular method, where a limb was twisted tightly until blood vessels snapped before sawing. The idea was to reduce bleeding during the cut by preemptively stopping circulation. Modern medicine would call this gross negligence bordering on torture, but on a pirate ship without reliable tourniquets, this was a handy hack. The result? Less blood loss, but often a horrifyingly twisted, swelling stump that looked like a burnt pretzel. One documented survivor from Henry Every's ship adventure galley famously endured this method and lived to tell the tale, though the aftermath looked like a nautical horror story. When it came to bandaging, pirates had to use whatever they could find: torn canvas, bits of linen, sometimes even patched sails cut into strips. Supplies were scarce, so recycling dressings happened, which, surprise, surprise, meant wounds often got reinfected. Pirates tried to compensate by burning rope fibers and herbs to keep flies away or deter germs, but success was spotty at best. Smoke-filled decks probably annoyed everyone except the rats, who were the unofficial hospital mascots. Healing wounds was less Tidy Tuesday and more hang on. It's gonna get worse before it gets better Tuesday. Yet somehow, these ragtag field hospitals kept enough pirates alive to man the cannons and fight another day. Despite all this, pirate medicine, as savage as it was, laid groundwork for battlefield surgery. Their ruthless speed and focus on stopping infections by immediate amputation was an early form of triage. Long before germ theory or anesthetics made surgery bearable, they didn't know bacteria were the villains, but they saw gangrene spreading and instinctively knew swift action saved lives. More than just guesswork, their brutal practices contributed to the slow evolution of emergency care and surgical methods, the rude, blood-soaked great-grandparents of modern trauma surgery. And don't think for a second that these amputations and treatments stayed secret, locked in some shackled chest. Pirate culture loved stories about survival, scars, and medical misadventures. These oral traditions passed down practical medical advice, like which herbs might help, how to make a decent tourniquet, or just when to get the saw out, through generations of pirates and sailors. So when you picture those classic pirates with wooden legs and hook hands waving their claws on a creaky deck, remember that those were battle scars and signs of resilience, proof that being a pirate wasn't just about plundering but raw, gritty survival against all odds. So next time you picture pirates shouting air and chasing treasure, remember they were also dodging death one bloody limb at a time, trusting